Guy Martin is a documentary photographer from the UK. He's based in Istanbul, and he will tell us about his amazing documentary project, The Parallel State. Let's give him a warm welcome. Guy Martin.
Thank you. It's really good to be here, and I'm really happy to finally talk about my project called The Parallel State. And I think it's important to talk about it as a project or in the context that I'm going to talk about it today. The project evolved over 7 years while I lived and worked in Turkey. And how it eventually ended up has been a book. But that's not the only way that has also come into view. It's been an exhibition, it's been an installation, it's been on websites, it's been in editorial publications. And the one thing that really kind of annoys me when photographers talk about their work is sometimes there's an assumption that you should all understand what they're talking about because it's in a book. And if you don't have the book, well then it's very hard to kind of engage with a book on that level if you haven't read it, or you haven't got it in your hands, or you've never heard the photographer or me speak before. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is actually kind of break down how this project came to be, how it came into being, into the way that I thought about the project, the way that I came to terms with who I was as a photographer, how I behave, what type of work I want to do, and ultimately what I want to achieve. And that is far different from ultimately looking at a set of polished prints on a wall or hundreds of images in a book. So I'm going to break down the process into how this work came to be. And there's YouTube clips, and there's work that isn't my own, but it's all to show you all of the many different strands of influence that I take into making the work that I do. So I thought long and hard about this because I think not to have mentioned this work or who I was before I made this body of work would have been a little bit ungenuine, a little bit unfair, and I think it would give you a greater understanding about me and my desires and my way that I look at photography. So for a long time, my relationship with photography is very difficult and complex, but mostly I was drawn from a very young age to wanting to photograph violence, to photographing war, and the extremes of humanity. And I think it was eerily easy for me to do that because I had a very clear understanding of what I wanted to do from when I was about 16 or 17 years old. And I pursued that dream to its almost logical conclusion. And in 2011, a moment happened in the Middle East, in North Africa, the Arab revolutions, the Arab Spring. I was in my late 20s at that time, and I found myself there and finally working for the people that I'd always dreamed who I wanted to work for. I was working for Time, I was working for the Wall Street Journal, I was working for the New York Times. My pictures were being on the front page of newspapers, the most read newspapers in the world. It was, I thought, what I wanted to be. And to do that, I think you have to sacrifice lots of things. You have to sacrifice a normal life, steady incomes, your family to some degree. You have to do everything to pursue this dream of becoming a war photographer. Now, I don't know why it was that I wanted to do it. Did I have to answer questions about myself, about being a man, about answering some deep family things, about wanting to prove myself? But to behave and to make engaging photographs in these situations, you do need to have certain skills, certain things that make you be able to work in them, being able to witness extreme violence, acts of war, dead bodies, death, those things. It takes a certain way of working, and for whatever reason, I find myself an insane ability to remain calm in the worst situations. And I've included this picture from Libya. These 3 pictures are from Libya that I'm going to show you. Because it's a picture not only because of what it shows in its violence, it's the aftermath of a NATO bombing strike on a Gaddafi-held position in the desert of central Libya. But it's that guy taking the picture with a phone. And that thing bugged me that day, because there were hundreds of Libyans that had got in their car, drove up to that scene, and photographed this scene for themselves. And I was really curious about what it is they were going to do with that. Where were they going to send that picture? What were they going to do with it? How were they going to share it? Where would it end up? It made me really question, what am I doing? What is my role, really? Who am I informing? Who am I telling this story to? Here I am trying to make these beautiful compositions of the most horrific things to try and do what? And I'll come back to this later in the presentation because it has a reference. And so it led to a moment in April the 11th, 2011, where I found myself in the besieged Libyan town of Misrata. I smuggled myself in on a boat, and we were surrounded on all sides by Gaddafi forces. I say we because I was with a number of other colleagues, and about half an hour after this picture was taken, 3 rockets were fired into the position, killed my 2 friends, Tim Hetherington and Chris Hondros, and it left me seriously wounded and bundled into the back of a truck with about 11 other dead bodies. So that's me being operated on in Misrata, an operation that would eventually miraculously save my life. And after something like that happens, I had to have a very, very long, hard think about the fuck I'm doing, or what I'm doing. And if I'm being really honest with myself, I think up until that point, photography had been using me, and I hadn't been using photography in the way that perhaps I wished I could have done. Because journalism, photography, documentary work, whatever you want to call it, is a very powerful drug. When you hang out with gang leaders, when you push yourself to the extremes of what you think is possible and you survive, it's almost like a narcotic. It's very hard to come off that drug. And I had to very early on in my career address those things. And so that is how the parallel state became into being what it is. It's a fundamental readdressing of what I consider documentary photography work and what I think its power can be if perhaps we can leave behind the extremes of witnessing violence and stereotypes in the Islamic world. So, I want to tell you what it is. The parallel state, you may have heard politicians and diplomats and Brexit party people talk about parallel states and deep states. But it's a uniquely Turkish phrase. So before the parallel state, there was the deep state, also a uniquely Turkish phrase. So it was first coined in the 50s when NATO installed these undercover units in Turkey to act as a potential nucleus in the event, a resistance nucleus in the event of a post-war invasion, communist invasion. These highly trained units, propagandists, bomb makers, espionage, spies, were all trained in a central unit, intentionally then decentralized out into the country. And they were often obviously very powerful and could carry out sinister, disruptive acts beyond the reach of any elected government. But despite being a clear liability, the existence of these state-like but unrecognized institutions was nevertheless accepted. And moreover, it was encouraged by successive military and political leaders as a way of always having a useful enemy. And I think that the thing about that is that I'm sure, unbeknownst to many of us in this room in 2019, we can all agree or all think of a party or a group of people in Europe. It's always very useful to have a useful enemy.
Geçeceğim de altıma sıçıyor. Oğlum ne biçim bir şey lan? Buradan çekerim anca ben. Oğlum bu ne kadar çok geçiyor Birkan abi. Ben hayatımda böyle bir şey görmedim.
Hayatımda F-16 görmedim.
Ananı sikeyim oğlum.
Alo. Evde misiniz? Balkona çıkmadı ha. F-16 göreceğim ki paket olmuyor.
Atıyor mu videosunu?
Ulan az önce patlama oldu, onu duydunuz mu?
Oğlum burada patlama oldu.
Ne ya? Allah Allah, internete yazmışlar yeni Bosna patlama oldu diye.
Ben sana ne dedim abi?
Kamil.
Ananı sikeyim. Ananın amına koyayım o ne? Allah'ım yardım et.
Camlar patladı ya. Evet.
And on the night of July 16th, 2016, that useful enemy became real. That thing that a politician had been telling its public for decades to always be wary of actually came out that night. The parallel state revealed itself, and there was a very real attempt to overthrow the country. So that's kind of zipped almost to the end of where this project is. But I'm going to go back again and tell you about how that moment came to be. So moving to Turkey after working and living in the Middle East for almost all of my career was a way for me to try and re-engage with photography again, to try and re-engage with the thing that I had almost paid the ultimate price for. And the way that I did that was that I read somewhere that Turkish soap operas were the most watched TV programs in the world, bar none. And they are. They far outnumber anything that HBO can put out, anything that the BBC can put out, because the global reach of Turkish soap operas spans from the Balkans to Indonesia. And what Turkey offered was a view, a story, a narrative of a modern, secular Islamic country. Its food, its storylines, its women, its men were poured over and analyzed as a way to really be a modern Islamic country. At the time, President Erdoğan was a reformer, a Democrat, a model politician for how we should all want our closest Islamic neighbor to be. And so I set out with nothing more than that intention, to try and photograph something so normal, something that we all take for granted, to be a photographer who is not Turkish, who is not from the Middle East or North Africa, but to try and immerse myself in something that we all consume, TV. What do we watch with our food at night? What do we go home to watch after we've been on the night out? We turn on the TV and we want to be entertained. Something that for far too long I think we can consider as a uniquely Western concept. But these little storylines of very famous soap actors and soap actresses are stories about Turkish wealth, sex. They were all there in this fictional world. But it did have a context because these soap operas were actively used and promoted by President Erdoğan and the government to sell Turkey, a uniquely powerful soft power tool. Everything in that region is a power play. Who has power, who doesn't have power. And so often I'd been on the end of those that don't have power, which often results in violence. But could I be at something at the beginning to witness power being made by something as easily pass-overable as a TV program? But for the entirety of this project, I also photographed real-life events. And so the pictures you've seen there, some of them are from Turkish soap opera sets, and some of them are made in real life. And so I'm posing you the question now, that strip away some of the context, the caption, how we immediately view photography, and what you're thinking of me right now as a documentary photographer is an inherently problematic term. The document implies that what I'm showing you is truth. It's kind of almost subconsciously agreed upon that what you're looking at is truthful because I'm here telling you this at this conference. But is it though? Is what you're seeing me produce, is what you're seeing an Egyptian photographer make, is what seeing your friend share on Facebook, is that truthful also? So I'm just going to break down a little bit of that and show you some scenes from soap operas. So this was from a very, very famous soap opera called Öyle Bir Geçer Zaman Ki, which means as time goes by. It's kind of like a Downton Abbey, but of a very modern kind of period. And I just fell in love with this program and its producers and its set and its actors because they gave me complete freedom, unbelievable freedom, to just walk around these sets and these locations and take pictures. You know, if you work on a film set in Europe or America, your camera has to be in a sound blimp and you have to be like a member of a trade union and all of these things. I had none of those problems. I would just basically stand next to the cameraman or woman and take 2 or 3 frames before the director said action, and then 2 or 3 frames after they said cut, and remain silent and motionless for the whole take. But in that way, I was still taking a document. These pictures weren't staged. They were in the moments when the actor was just about to act and in the moments when the acting had finished. So I wasn't completely losing my marbles. There was still something factual in this. But what it enabled me to do is once you take out the context of the sound man, the boom operator backstage, you're left with what millions and millions and millions and millions of people watch every night. I was seeing what a global reach of hundreds of millions of Muslim viewers were seeing. And for the first time in my career working in the Muslim world, I was finally close or closer to families and women, something that had always been a little bit hard for an outsider, for a man to get into. I'd always hang out with the men, the brothers, the boys, but very rarely be involved in these settings in a domestic scene. And finally, through the fictional world, I was inhabiting that space. And the thing that was, I think, at that time, what made Turkish soap operas so powerful is that their storylines about women were incredible, incredible, strong female characters, matriarchs, protagonists, the ones having the affairs, the ones shooting people. This storyline was great. She was a hostage and she was supposed to be exchanged in a prisoner exchange, but she kind of has the gun behind her back and she comes out and shoots her hostages and runs off with her boyfriend. It was amazing. But the thing that I think set the tone for this was that it was a program that was devoid of the icons of how we perceive that country to be. There are no mosques in this body of work. You won't see one. There are no Turkish flags. There are no headscarves. There are no praying men. There are no praying women. And slowly and surely, as this project was evolving, I was stripping away these layers that we all assume we want to see when working at bodies of work in the Muslim world. An ISIS soap opera on the borders of southern Turkey and northern Syria. Incredibly black, dark humor. Incredibly black. So black it made you terrified. Actually, even as a British person, it was really dark. But these guys found it hilarious. It should actually be said that a farmer called the Turkish Secret Service on this when we were there, and we were all arrested because he thought ISIS had come into Turkey. But on first glance, or without that context, or without me telling you this story, you might believe that that might be ISIS. My intention is not to confuse you. My intention is to begin asking a very visual, literate audience to begin asking questions of me and to begin asking questions of yourselves about how you consume and digest photography. So I spent a long time on soap operas, on and off 6 or 7 years. And as I began to edit and work through this work, there were some fairly stark images or moments that began to crystallize. Deja vu moments. Two versions of Istanbul. One, a glorious but very cheap curtain that we pulled over budget film sets for couples having a talk in a window in a bedroom and they couldn't afford to go on location. This vision of a nostalgic Istanbul over the Bosphorus looking towards the Anatolian side would be put across. But the more time I spent in Turkey, the more enamored I became of that country, the more I learned about it, the more I lived in it. A darker Orwellian vision of Turkey came to me. Anytime I'd do stories that were assigned by newspapers or editors, might be in the suburbs, in these nowhere lands, where Chechen fighters, Tajik fighters came in safe houses before they joined the caliphate in the south of the country. Young boys, young families that were preparing to join Daesh. That, to me, was becoming my Turkey, a dark, foreboding place. But it's interesting that I use the word Orwellian because we see that a lot now. How many protests do we see about women's rights with women dressed up as characters from Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale? The use of cinema, the use of TV, the use of novels, the use of literature in the way that we tell stories is something that we're becoming very sophisticated in. And I felt that I needed to include that. They're both blue. They're both visions of a city, but they're stark. Which one is real? It doesn't matter. Or when there were protests, I saw protesters that were young, secular, white Turks, pro-European. I didn't see any guys with headscarves. I didn't see anybody wrapping their faces and hiding their faces. I saw girls from Nişantaşı, which is like the Fulham or Chelsea of Istanbul, turning up to protests with blow-dried hair, nail varnish and iPhones, and Burberry trench coats. This was an attempt by me to try and reframe the way that we see a country. But that picture at the beginning, the dead Libyan soldier, his arms splayed out, not too dissimilar to this picture. It's not too dissimilar from that picture either. Same body language, same body positioning from me. Photographing dead people, you assume a kind of position to point your lens down, to compose. You don't get too close. Which one's real? Or are they both fake? The guy on the ground is part of real life. He was part of a protest in 2013 called the Gezi Park protests, which were a pitch battle between, at the beginning, young ideological green protesters that didn't want a mosque and a car park built in the center of Taksim, but quickly, in the center of Istanbul, but quickly escalated into a nationwide kind of revolt against President Erdoğan. But that guy in that picture performed for me. That guy curated that scene for me. That guy, when he saw that I was coming towards him, his friends pushed him on the ground, ripped open his shirt, and presented him to me as the victim. Is that a real document? Could I have filed that picture? Could I have sent that picture? Could that picture have been captioned in a way that would reveal what really happened? Or does he have such a sophisticated and literal view of the world that he knew what I was there to do? He knew his story. He knew his story, the underdog. And what does any revolution or protest need? It needs narratives. And he knew what I was there to do. And the actress. And as the years went on, these things would happen again. I'd be on a set of a soap opera actually called The Deep State. And then I'd see these same color ties and these men in suits. But the little badge is from MIT, it's Turkish intelligence. These guys were there in the aftermath of the ISIS bombing in Ankara. Simple, it's a little gesture, color, tone, palette. But begin placing images like that next to each other. Could I begin to now have enough material to begin to try and tell this complex story of a parallel state where a country is being fed lies and disinformation through its media, through its social media, people being asked to make impossible decisions, but with a background of violence? Was that Turkey, or could that be a metaphor for somewhere else? Little gestures of the arms, breaking the fourth wall, that cameraman looking directly at me, the outsider. That scene of that politician begging with someone to trust them after a huge suicide bomb. It's a performance for me. And I've always just loved that picture on the right because her tattoo looks like a bullet hole. And so I think that the way that I began to construct this book and why I wanted to include certain images and why I had to leave certain images out really is about to do with the edit. And so I think it helped me in being told these stories to include these pictures into the book. If these stories hadn't been told to me that I'm going to just show you a few examples now, I don't think I could have included them in the book. The birdcage. So after the Gezi Park protest in 2013, there's a very famous story of a young boy, 13-year-old boy, that was shot in the head with a rubber bullet. And when Turkish riot police fire rubber bullets, they kind of don't fire them on a trajectory like that. They fire them straight like that. So if they make contact with you, chances are you're going to really hurt yourself or they're going to kill you. And this young boy called Baron Elvin is from this district, a very tough, hard, working-class district on the suburbs of Istanbul, like that blue vision of the city that I showed you out there. And after he died, after he was hit with a bullet, he stayed in a coma for 12 months, 13 months, and he eventually died. And he became iconic. Kind of Obama hope-style stencils were drawn up of him all around this neighborhood. He was a hero, a martyr. And I went there with colleagues time and time again to try and speak to his family, but they didn't want to speak to us. They didn't want to speak to journalists. I tried again and again and again. But one day I just went there for a walk with a friend, and we walked around, and I took pictures of these posters and these graffiti of him, and we went into a tea house. And this thing in Turkey happens, this kind of sport, I guess you could say it, but it's where different cafes, different tea houses have competitions to see which bird can sing the most beautiful song. So it's entirely done by men that are like the size of houses with leather jackets. It's an incredibly effeminate sport, but only done by men. But they would have their prized songbird in a cage. And then this guy was wrapping this cellophane around this bird cage. I asked him why he was doing it, and he said, the air here is dirty. We need to protect it. It's a metaphor, a beautiful Turkish metaphor for saying that this city stinks. I hate this place. He carried on doing it. He put a black cloth over it, hung it in the window, so that when he would take it to the opposing cafe thing, you rip off the cloth, the bird is like, oh, la, 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 and it sings a very beautiful song. Anyway, I had coffee, he told me the story, it was very cool. And I left, again, dejected, thinking that I hadn't made a picture of this family or this boy. And he tapped me on the shoulder and he said, you were looking for Baron Elvin, weren't you? And I said, yeah, I was actually. He said, you know what we call him here? We call him the songbird that lost his wings. And I thought that that was a really beautiful metaphor for something that was horrible, that talked about protest and death and violence. But I did it, or found a way to make a picture that could exist without showing it. So could I show you violence without actually showing it? Well, there's her, Turkish actress in a very famous Turkish soap opera, Vilma Ellis. She's German. She's 6'4" and an incredible powerhouse in Turkish cinema and Turkish film. She married a Turkish footballer from Besiktas. She's celebrity numero uno in that country. But she couldn't speak a word of Turkish before her agent got her a job in Turkey. And she played the adulteress, the one that all the men have the affairs with, and she breaks up the house and all the rest of it. And, you know, incredible character. And I'll show you a brief clip of her at work.
Ayaklarınla tıpış tıpış mahkemeye geleceksin.
Kenan hiçbir şey yapamaz, korkma.
Acele et Karol. Holding'de işler seni bekliyor.
Ben Carolina Caso son international görüşmek istiyorum.
Hazır olsun.
Ne nerede?
Anne, babama bir şey mi oldu?
Bu dünyada seni benden daha iyi anlayacak bir kişi daha yoktur.
Bir kişi vardı. Ama öldü.
Vesayeti bana vereceksin.
Sonra olmayacak.
Yalvarırım size, ne olur gitmeyin.
Geberteceğim anne. Temizleyeceğim ikisini de.
Ali! Ali iptal!
She ultimately met a very sticky end on that one, but the reason why she's in the book is obviously because she's German, but because of one thing, her unique relationship to the president. She is, as a celebrity, very close to Erdoğan and his ruling party. She's there at every iftar meal with him. She's there with a host of TV celebrities and a real soft power tool to get his message out. So whenever there is social unrest, she will take to Twitter and beg people to go home. Don't go to the mosques. Don't go to the streets. Believe our president. Incredible. And the one that I think really helped me kind of try and pull these strands together with this. On the night of 3rd of November 1996, in a small town of Şırşılık in Turkey's Balıkesir province, a car crash occurred that resulted in the deaths of 4 individuals traveling together. One of the 4 intended victims survived the crash. Abdullah Chatler, a former ultra right-wing militia wanted by police for multiple murders and drug trafficking. Hussein Koshadar, a policeman. And the beauty queen Goncha Us, Chatler's girlfriend. They were all killed. But the fact is that those three individuals should not really have been traveling in that car at the same time. Anyway, the car crash was a massive event in the unraveling of a parallel structure in the early 90s. The idea that possibly, quite possibly, there is something fishy going on, that there are people working behind the scenes underground to destabilize the country. A lot of investigations, no conclusions were brought, but it was known as the Sirchaluk scandal. The car that they were in at that time was a mint-coloured Mercedes 600. So then I find myself on a soap opera in 2016 with a story about a mint-coloured Mercedes 600, a beauty queen, a policeman, and a drug trafficker. Can I prove to you that that was some sort of deep state play by the TV channels to subconsciously remind people that Turkey is full of deep state operatives? No. But it's how popular fiction and how popular narrative can become into the bloodstream of popular culture, how we look at TV. You know, in the UK, we have these, you know, that very famous series, The Bodyguard, anything from HBO and the latter series of Homeland. You know, that opening scene of The Bodyguard in the UK was the quivering but lethal female suicide bomber in a train. Headscarfed woman, all in black with a suicide vest around her. Much of the latter series of Homeland have been focused on the Middle East and North Africa. You begin to see how these narratives and these stories can slowly come into our everyday lives through fiction. But we don't quite know it, we don't address it. And so towards the end of this project, I didn't really know what I was doing, if I'm quite honest with you. I'm trying to make a good effort of trying to make it sound as I knew what I was doing, but honestly, I was all over the place. I knew I wanted to call the project The Parallel State, but the more you read about things, the more you get confused. And at that time, Erdoğan was definitely not on the Democrat reformist kind of agenda. He was on the power grab, populist, nationalist agenda. And I kept, as he called these elections and referendums, which resulted in kind of very close 50-40 splits, 50-60 splits, the east of the country and the peace process with the Kurds in the east broke down. And there was violence. And slowly, I found myself going down that rabbit hole again, of being drawn to violence. But I just could not take those pictures anymore. I could not take those pictures of a family asking me to come to a funeral, or the casket being buried, or trying to prove a family story that someone had shot up their house and had done this and done that, because I couldn't answer it and I couldn't do the thing that those people were expecting me to do. I was failing as a journalist. But I was drawn to these bullet holes around everywhere. And I think the bullet hole, a single one, I think we all can recognize that shape, what that might look like, what that might sound like, far more than a whole town or a village that has been destroyed and the sandbags. And it's so exotic that it is beyond the realm, I think, of most of us to comprehend. But little bullet holes in shop front windows, I think we can get that in the West, in safe countries, in Holland, in America, in the UK. You might imagine the sound that it makes when it hits a piece of metal. And I became really intrigued by these bullet holes in the internet boxes or the telephone exchanges at the end of streets in the southeast of the country, in the Kurdish area. Fairly rudimentary way of trying to destroy some communication, some wires. But this was the moment that I thought I was a fucking artist, and I was like, this is it. I found it. Project full of telephone boxes. This is the one for me. And I began to think about it, because imagine how much you have to hate someone to rip out by hand their power line and their internet. Look at what someone's done there. They've gone to the end of a street with a crowbar and ripped out someone's power from their neighborhood. And I think it was kind of that idea of a nationalism, of a racism between Turks and Kurds, although I realize it's far more complex than that, but essentially that's what it is. How you can hate someone that much that that's what you want to do. I left with this for a year, almost 2 years before I came back, and I bumped into the police officer in charge of that district. And he said, the insurgent youth wing of the PKK that inhabit spaces in Turkey, he could quantify through data that they're terrible fighters when they can't upload to Facebook in the morning. Knowing that his men, if they could disrupt the flow of digital information to Twitter, to Facebook, to Instagram, that they couldn't get their hero message out, that they would be worse fighters if they didn't get likes and numbers viewing their work. So that's why 2 years after I took those pictures, I can stand behind them and include them in the work, in the book. And also down in the southeast, you hear this other thing, akrep, scorpion. It means scorpion. So we were about to interview a mother who'd been displaced from her house. She was just about to sit down on her chair, and this massive scorpion came out from underneath some bags. She took her slipper off, and she killed it straight away. Threw it out, and I just took a picture of it, just because I thought it was kind of nice. She went on to say in this interview that the akreps are everywhere here. What she meant was the akrep is a slang word for this armoured Land Rover that drives around her neighbourhood all the time. Not doing much, just surveillance, but pissing her off. Then I found out, through that, there was a Turkish film in the 80s called Akrep. And so I went down this rabbit hole then of collecting movie posters whenever I was travelling around, of these movies from the late 70s to 80s. And then I remembered I had a bullet hole picture that looked like the font of some of the movie posters that I was collecting. So I was archiving all this material, not really know what to do with it, but just knowing that it was building up to something. And then really, finally, the kittens. These girls. And these are hosts of a late night, loosely themed Islamic kind of talk show. All cosmetically enhanced women that talk conspiracy theories late into the night, but are surrounded by this one kind of demagogue figure, this guy called Adnan Oktar.
Canımdan çok sevdiğim bir tanemle sohbetimize başlıyoruz.
Evet, maşallah, maşallah, maşallah.
Aşkım ruhum hocamla sohbetimize devam ediyoruz.
So that's kind of early, and then after 10 o'clock, things get wild. Oh. Incredible programming. And so we go back to where we started, that night of July 16th, 2016, and that attempt to overthrow a government. And what those generals did is they left a digital footprint. They left a WhatsApp group of a night about how to overthrow a government. And myself and the team at bellingcat.com transcribed and translated this WhatsApp group was found. And I'm not going to repeat all of it, but there's just some of it here. Colonel Sahin says that everything's pressing ahead as planned. These TV channels need to be silenced. So they're very aware to run a coup that you need to silence the internet and the TV channels. They didn't do it. But they were, as Colonel Kaya says, deeply worried about fake news. And that was way before Donald Trump began talking about that. Here's Erdoğan appearing on FaceTime on CNN.
Buyurun sayın.
I won't show you the whole clip, but an incredible document. We're slightly running out of time, but I just wanted to show you some clips that looked like Mars attacks. And it all helped me basically just reaffirm the idea to try and include images that had some sort of cinematic feel to them. I just click through to the last 5 pictures and then we're... But that night, I didn't make a single picture. I just photographed outside my apartment window that night that a coup happened. But it looked pretty normal. Everybody at home watching TV, being scared, being worried. And so I'll just show you the first chapter of the book, how I began to sequence and think about this story. So that's it. I'll just end on this. Making work like this is expensive. It takes a long time. And I wrote a grant proposal in 2014. I didn't get the money. But I tried to articulate what I was trying to do with this project. And I said the parallel state is what happens when men in power aim to divide the population with malicious falsehoods, simultaneously control and sow doubt in the media, and enforce a culture of chaos and unchecked violence in which any sort of objective, truth-based reality ceases to exist. And I think, unbeknownst to me, that reality is with us now in 2019. Thank you.
Questions?
Just a short question. How did you edit? Did you work with a storyboard in the end, or how did you make the story?
The book together?
Yes.
Yeah. So I worked with a publisher, a photo book publisher, and a designer. But the main thing that I set out with him from the outset was that I didn't want the book to have any captions. So I didn't want you to be able to flick to the back page and find out if this picture was real or not, or where did it come from. So instead, we started looking at cinema, cinema. So, I love the cinematography of people like Roger Deakins, who use color theory and color tone as a way to edit their films. So if you watch like Blade Runner or The Assassination of Jesse James or anything like that, color in cinema denotes mood, how you should feel about a certain movie. When you see a yellow scene or something that is red or blue, it denotes trepidation, or blue does anyway, or fearfulness, or to be scared. And so we sequence the book through color theory, basically. So anytime that there's a group of images that are blue, it's a build-up to something, a prelude. Anytime that it's grays and yellows and whites, it's action or violence. Anytime that it's yellow and red, it's kind of on the way out, and the storyline kind of changes pace. So that's how we began to think about sequencing a photo book of still images to try and denote the story and the narrative that I am. It is supported. The WhatsApp messages groups are in there, and there's a few essays. But really, I'm relying on your imagination to guide through this book and to take out your own narratives from it.
Another question, yeah.
the climate in Turkey is getting worse and worse for journalists and artists, from what I gather from the news. How does that affect you, or how do you see it?
Yeah, it's one of those awkward questions to ask, because as foreigners, there is always some leniency towards being a foreign reporter. If you're properly accredited and you have a foreign press pass and you have a residency permit, then by and large, you're okay. However, that's not the same for local journalists. That's not the same for anybody with an independent voice or an independent mind. A lot of them are in jail through like a systematic kind of tear down of the fabric of society. You turn the judges and the law house to your favor. You destroy newspapers, and media organizations become pro-government. You have pro-government channels. Your budget of Erdoğan's ruling party far outstrips anything to kind of tackle and to put money into social media. But, you know, I think there is, particularly in Turkey at the moment, there is a hope, because I think because of the use of social media, that these elections, these reruns, that there's a kind of groundswell. You know, 20% of Turkey's population is under 25. And as hard as Erdoğan and his government try to curtail social media, they can't. So I think that is a telling thing. But no, anybody that reported on the coup that wasn't favourable to the government are arrested and accused of being treasonous. At the moment, there's an incredible reverse migration of doctors, nurses, lecturers that are taking the same boats and the same routes that Syrian refugees did into Greece, because they're on government lists, for part of being a parallel structure. And so, yeah, the very fabric of a society is being broken down and eroded. And that includes journalists and people, particularly local journalists, that are either in jail or have left the country. So it's very hard. But as an outsider, as long as your paperwork is in order, you're largely spared what local journalists have to go through, which is a very uneasy position.
Yeah. I find myself being a little bit fascinated with the German lady who is an actress in
Wilma, yeah.
Turkish soap opera and befriended with Erdogan.
Yeah.
Did she play a role at all during the elections? Because also in Germany there's a really big Turkish population, so that's why I'm so
Yeah, she does. She campaigns for him. So she was there primarily actually as a soft power tool to make sure that Turks in Germany watch Turkish TV.
Yeah.
So obviously Turks in Germany have a very special status, and have done since for a very long time, but particularly after the Second World War. And so Erdogan needs that foreign vote every time that there's a referendum or an election. And that's why you see these things anytime, you know, there's a big flare-ups with the embassy, the German embassy and the Turkish embassy in Berlin, I think, over a case. It's because this idea of being Turkish and German, the footballer Mehmet Özil, who is always trying to define his Germanness as much as he is his Turkishness. And so I think for someone like her, she's a weapon in this kind of celebrity ability for Erdogan to attract voters to him and his power base, because she believes in what he says. And because she's married a Turkish footballer, from her interviews and speaking to her, she probably considers herself more Turkish now than she does German. So, yeah, these things about identity really, and I think, like, ultimately, I think actually what that is about, really, those movie posters and what Turkey is going through is actually a very deep quest for an identity. Who is it? What is it? Is it secular, like it was founded in 1923? Or is it more nationalist and Islamic, like the current version of Turkey's leader is? Perennial quest for identity, and in many cases through its TV and fiction.
Well, thank you, Guy Martin, for your story, for showing us your pictures. These last pictures, it was so quiet when you showed them to us, and if I feel what you feel, we were moved. Thank you so much, Guy Martin.